Thanks, Mark. And yeah, well, welcome everybody. And I'll give you just a very quick rundown on the panelists. Professor Peter Schofield, he has a joint appointment as the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of Neuroscience Research Australia, and is also a professor in the School of Medicine at the University of New South Wales. Dr. Caroline Foster, AusGO Research Fellow at the Australian Astronomical Observatory, and Associate Professor Peter Slezak from the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales, as you heard, philosophy and philosophy of science. Now, Caroline is an extragalactic astronomer, not from outside the galaxy, but interests in galaxy formation and evolution, as well as cosmological voids, or you could say more properly, the study of nothing. And so I thought I'd start with Caroline, because I'm sure we're all wondering how you get paid to study nothing. So I have two questions, but I'll start with this one about nothing first. That is, what is this nothing that you study? How do you study nothing, and what are you hoping to learn from this?
Okay. I think maybe a little bit about scale first, so that you guys can understand how big these nothings are. Maybe that will make them interesting. So a parsec is essentially 3.2 light years. So that's the distance that light would travel in 3.2 years. Okay? You put 1 million of those, that's 1 megaparsec, so 1 million parsecs. Okay? 10 times that, that's roughly the diameter of these voids that I was studying. So essentially they're bubbles or foams that are defined by the outskirts of them are essentially galaxies. So that was a big surprise in some of the big redshift surveys that happened, that people were not expecting the universe to be foamy, if you want, the galaxies to be distributed like that. And so there's a lot to be gleaned from basically the shape of them, but also their sizes. So that's what I was studying.
Okay, all right, thank you, very good. All right, there you go. Thank you for that explanation. Now, okay, Steven Weinberg has said this, he's a physicist as well. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. I was just wondering, as an astronomer, you're on the macro scale of things. You're confronted with the, megaparsecs, the vastness of the universe, as well as just the way the universe seems to be, tuned for in particular ways. And I'm just wondering whether that has caused you to reflect then at all on the purpose of humanity in that big picture.
It has, for sure. I think it's very difficult to find or to use, in opinion, all right, for me to find purpose using science in that sense. Indeed, you look at just the vastness of the universe. So we live on a little planet around one star, which is amongst billions of stars within one galaxy. And I was just telling you that these galaxies define these bubbles. Well, we already know of probably 1 billion and more galaxies, and we think there are billions more that we haven't yet detected, right? So that makes you, it gives you a sense of humility, perhaps, and puts things into perspective, and also, referring to Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, where basically he's thinking about Voyager looking back at the Earth, and it's just this little dot, little speck in a distance, and everyone lives there, everything, the wars, the religions, and so forth, that we wage on each other. And his conclusion is that we actually ought to cut each other some slack. So there is something to be learned about purpose if you want, but maybe not the purpose of humanity as a whole. I'm not sure that the vastness of the universe helps us there.
Okay, all right, but humility maybe is something we can glean from. Yes, okay. Thanks, Caroline. Now over to you, Peter Schofield. You study mental illness, particularly bipolar disorder is one of the main interests. And but an ill brain suggests a healthy brain as well, that there's an idea of a healthy brain. So does healthy just mean the most common state of brains among humanity, or does healthy refer to some other kind of assumption or presupposition about humanity that would mean that this is a healthy brain rather than that?
That's a lovely, simple question. So I think we can see from illness a perspective on what we might think of as normality or health. And that's a practical and pragmatic question, because individually we go mostly, I'm not working as well as I think I should. I'd like to be working at that other level. Perhaps the flip of your question, though, is what is the distribution of brain function? Because the way you asked me the question, you were sort of saying, well, health is over here. Does that mean normal is in the middle of the distribution and there's something supernormal over here? I don't have an answer for you, but it is a very interesting way of thinking about how our brains are wired, how they're put together, how they work for us, and how my perspectives and perceptions on the world, I think, are normal. But you think yours are normal, and they might or might not be the same.
Right. Okay, so nothing fundamental coming out of that question of the distinction between healthy and normal in terms of assumptions about what makes a human a functioning human, or the best it can be.
Well, because I think it's sort of the way that the disability community would talk. I am not a person with bipolar. I am not defined by my illness. I'm a person. I just happen to also have this condition or that attribute. And so I think that's also a good way of thinking about the way in which our brains work. You know, if I have an illness, if I have a mental illness, I still have a brain, it is still working, it is still serving me in my life and my perception of the world. That might be different from yours, and that might be partly due to the illness, and it might not be, but yeah.
Good, thanks, Peter. Over to the other Peter Slezak. Now, you're our kind of resident philosopher, so I thought I'd go with a definition question for you. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Magic of Reality, and the conclusion of that book says this. So where does life come from? What is it? Why are we here? What are we for? What is the meaning of life? There's a conventional wisdom which says that science has nothing to say about such questions. Well, all I can say is that if science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. So, love your reaction to that quote. You're a philosopher, so is that offensive to you? And there's this question about scientism. I was hoping you could define for us scientism, and is this bordering on that kind of idea?
Well, look, on the meaning of life and how science illuminates that or doesn't, I mean, I sort of agree with Dawkins, but the other way I'd put it is that science does answer the question. There is no meaning to life. I mean, science tells you a lot about what makes sense and what doesn't, and the question is kind of silly, because people don't notice that the term meaning or purpose, as I think might be appropriate, is something that is really in Peter's domain. It's something that comes with brains and sentient organisms. They have purposes. The question of the purpose of everything doesn't make sense. It's a silly question. I mean, it just is. And you can't even ask the question sensibly about the whole universe and the cosmos. And so in a way, these questions that drive a lot of people, they're a kind of curiosity that's based on a kind of philosophical mistake. The question is silly. And in a way, what follows from that is that we should look for purpose not in the whole universe, whether it's big or small. I mean, to go back to Caroline's point, I don't know whether people feel more comforted if the world wasn't as big as you said it was. If it was smaller, would you feel any better? I mean, you know, it tells you the question's silly. So, I mean, the only answer, I think, to the question is the purpose is within your life. It has to come from what purposes we give our lives and make sense of our existence in terms of the goals that we have and so on. And that's the only way the question makes any sense. So I agree with Dawkins about science, and I agree that there's no other way to find out anything meaningful about the universe except through science. So I'm on his side. I mean, I don't like a lot of things about Dawkins, but I agree with him on that anyway.
Okay, and then a definition of scientism, because that is a word that gets bandied about in these kind of questions sometimes. So if you could give us a definition, your definition of science.
Well, it's used in all sorts of ways. I think the general idea is that it's some kind of abuse of science or misuse of science or overestimation of the importance of science. I'm not sure whether I'm guilty of scientism, but to repeat, I think science is the only way you get answers to anything. Look, one of the important things about science is it took, thousands of years to evolve to a very highly refined form of rationality. It's a way of finding how to inquire into the world that avoids the biases and the human errors that we make. It's a highly refined social institution that's the best way we have of understanding the world. And so I'm a great fan of science. I'm a frustrated scientist. I wish I was still doing some science. So I don't know whether scientism is a kind of a rude word for people that somehow overreach the bounds of appropriate inquiry in science. Well, I'm not sure what that means.
Sure, okay. Now, in terms of overreaching the bounds of science and what scientists actually think about in the lab, I just thought I'd ask the two resident scientists, when you're in your lab fiddling with DNA in a petri dish or whatever it is, or you're staring at galaxies, are you thinking about these bigger questions and saying, oh, I wonder if science is going to answer this question for me? Are your colleagues thinking about those questions? Yeah, just curious as to what the practice is.
Look, I'd pick a little from Peter's comments there. I think that when you're actually in the process of conducting a scientific experiment, doing the research, you're probably actually trying to use some rigor and discipline, asking the question in a robust way that will try to actually answer it in a factual way. What you asked me, though, is a different question. When I'm looking at the amazing complexity of our genetic code and how it wires up our brain, does that give me time or the reason to pause and think, this is really quite phenomenally amazing in the complexity of the universe, but in a much more restricted space, about how such a small number of instructions can lead to such an incredible diversity and enable this biological machine to not only record and hold for decades facts and figures and information and images and memories and sense of smell and so forth, but also to come back and then ask some of these bigger questions. So do I sit there every day thinking that? No. But every so often you get to that point where you do just sort of think about these two things and go, there's a very interesting conundrum here.
All right.
I think in answering that, I have thought about what's the purpose and why am I doing this and why am I looking at stars that are so far away? I don't make any difference in anybody's life by analyzing this galaxy and how it moves around. But so I've had these sort of existential questions, obviously. But I would like to politely disagree, if I may, with the fact that that the question of purpose doesn't make sense. I'm sure this is nothing perhaps new under the sun, but I'm sure other people have thought the same. But I can't help but thinking, if I find a piece of technology, alien technology, be it from outer space or from some other society or maybe an archaeological dig or some sort, and it looks like it's technological, we want to understand what does it do. Well, we may actually start, pulling it apart and then understanding its functions, and we might understand the how. But we might actually never find out its purpose unless we can go and ask the engineer or the person who actually made it, why did you make this thing? Oh, this is used for such and such a purpose. And so I see the universe very much, just very reductionistically as a thing, if you want. And for me, obviously, with my background as a Christian, it has a creator, an engineer, if you want, and so there must be a purpose to it. So,
can I come back quickly on that?
Yeah.
Look, here's a question for you then. I mean, this is a well-known and famous argument about the design, and it had to have been designed by an intelligence. But just about purpose, I mean, it's not original with me. I have to give credit to the joke to another philosopher, but he said, look, does the chicken get its purpose for becoming my chicken sandwich, afterwards? How can the purpose for the chicken be somebody else's outside intentions for you? So the idea that your purpose in life comes from a being outside is itself a slightly odd idea. It goes back to my idea that the only purpose comes from my life, not for the fact that somebody else had a purpose for me, assuming that even makes sense or is true scientifically. So I'm not sure that it helps make sense of my life if I know someone else is looking after me or doing it for me.
I think that, can I respond quickly?
Okay, yeah. All right, yes. Give it a quick shot, and then I want to move on. Yeah.
So we were talking before about purpose. I see here sort of two different purposes. There's a purpose with a big P, which is what I'm talking about here, the guy who, a being or an intelligence or order or something who made the laws and so forth, and the universe exists. For some reason, it's here. And the purpose with a little p, which is what I think you're referring to, which I agree. I mean, everyone has to find out their own purpose for themselves. And indeed, yeah, you can get some references, and I think indeed science there can really help. But yeah, I'm not sure that for the big P purpose of why is the universe even there in the first place, I think for that we'd have to ask whoever made it.
Okay, all right, good, thanks. Now, we've got a question from the audience, and I want to lead into that question with a quote from Francis Crick, who's the double helix DNA sort of fame guy. He says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And the question we have is, as a geneticist, so to you first, anyone else can comment, can we see purpose from our DNA? Is there something encoded there that instructs us about the purpose of humanity? This might be just a simple yes or no answer, but...
Well, I think we have to agree with Francis Crick in the first instance that we can manifestly see that there is no more there than is there in the actual physical entity. But we're now back at the question of purpose. And so, as humans, we have this phenomenal ability to actually transcend above and beyond the chemical constituents that we are. We are sentient beings, and so each of us, I think, can then, in two senses, probably find the small p purposes, as you were using, Caroline, about my understanding of the world, but can also try to put that into a theological or a cosmological framework as well. So I think Crick was technically correct, but remember, Crick spent most of his latter life trying to understand what was consciousness.
Yep.
Because it was that intangible which was almost impossible to define in a biological or a chemical sense. But we all knew that each one of us here had it and was able to exercise it. And so it does become one of those really fundamental questions of that. How can you take science across to religion, to philosophy, to those questions which rely on the scientific element but actually span across?
Our other Peter, do you want to make a comment?
I was going to jump in. Crick spent a lot of his time on consciousness, which of course philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about. It's a big mistake. I mean, people don't worry about their kidneys and where there could be some transcendent phenomenon going on, and I don't have to explain to you, you know better than I do. The kidney and the brain are just two different kinds of cell assemblies, exactly. And they just do different things. And there's no reason to think that, but the reason philosophers worry about consciousness is because we can introspect. As far as anybody else is concerned, they're just robots. They're all machines. And science doesn't give you any grounds for thinking otherwise. But unfortunately, we can think with our brain, and then we think it's somehow special. But it's just like the kidney, only different. That's
very good. Okay, think of that when you think of your brain next time. Now, I thought I'd go back, another question from the audience, to a more astronomical scale. This is a question about Lawrence Krauss's book on nothingness and how you create a universe from nothing. Really, the question is really, does anyone have any comment? But I guess I'd add to that, do you have any, what's your reflection on his idea of nothing, if that idea is familiar to you?
It's not.
It's not? Okay, all right. Peter, are you au fait with Lawrence Krauss's?
Well, a little bit, but I'll turn the question back to Caroline in a minute, because philosophers have debated with theologians about whether it makes sense, as I understand, and you can help with the physics, the idea of a singularity and that it all came out of nothing. And so there's a lot of debate about what nothing is and whether something could come out of nothing. And I had a debate with a theologian about exactly this. But it was interesting because it did take up the serious questions which you're the expert on and what it means to talk about, the singularity, the Big Bang nothingness. So that's an interesting question, what that means from a scientific point of view and whether you can read theological conclusions into that. I don't think so, but that's a question of what the science says.
I think many scientists will find any singularity as a sort of offense, if you want. I don't know if I can speak for everyone here, but I mean, the fact that everything could be in a single dot, I mean, the whole concept is, I'm not sure that it even makes sense to the people who actually postulated these theories in the first place. And so this is obviously one of the reasons why people are still looking for the grand theory of everything, because they still think that there's got to be, I mean, we observe the effect that there is indeed a lot of matter in very, very tiny little spaces. That's got to be a singularity, but it's still got to be something physical, not just my equations broke down. Yes. There's got to be a better explanation, like physical. Again, you know, not that I know this for a fact, but in my mind, like it's frustrating to think that we started from a singularity. Like and yeah, you can read whatever you want into that. Like people I know have gone on really wild speculations as to what the singularity might be, and some have attributed this to being of some sort, but I don't think that the science is clear at all on that sort of aspect. So.
But science has always said surprising things. Yeah. If empty space is curved, I find that just as disturbing, or whatever else science tells you. In fact, the whole history of science is people get upset. I mean, evolution was very disturbing. So the fact that it's disturbing just means you defer your intuitions to what science tells you. You just do the equations and don't worry about it. That's Feynman's answer. Just do the math and don't ask what it means, or don't try to imagine it.
So can I follow up with a nothingness question, and from Lawrence Krauss's idea? That is that when he postulates that you can create a universe from nothing, his nothingness is in a sense a simple state, the simplest state of quantum state in a sense that then erupts into whatever we have now. So I guess I'm just wondering whether we can call that nothing, or how we define nothing, and maybe that's a question for the both of you. Whether a simple physical
state... I defer to the scientist on that.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a deeply philosophical question. I mean, are the laws of nature that we're actually measuring and finding out how the universe works, the stuff that, my bread and butter, basically, is that something tangible? I mean, I can write equations on a board and predict where this planet will be tomorrow and so on and so forth, but is that something? Or is that nothing? It's not really nothing, is that really something? I don't know, is it? I don't know if...
Well, the equations are different from what they describe. An equation is a description. I mean, it's like words. So you've got the world, and then you're finding ways of describing it, and better or worse, and you improve it. So where the equations come from, I mean, people worry about what mathematics is and what the status of the numbers are, and whether they exist in some sense like tables and chairs. That's a difficult question. Whether that's nothing or not, I mean, it's not science, though. That's kind of the status of mathematics, and you can give psychological explanations for that, but that's a whole, lecture course.
Great. All right. Let me ask another purpose question from Richard Dawkins, and this may be a brief one, which will be okay because it'll give us more time to do some other things before we finish. But Dawkins says this. He says the universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. So there, he's assigned a purpose to humanity, and that is to propagate DNA. You're a geneticist. Does that ring true, or what's your reaction to that?
Well, I guess technically, that I think is a truism. I think that does come out of evolution. It does leave me rather unsatisfied with regard to purpose, though.
Right. So that idea of purpose doesn't do it for you. It doesn't.
I don't consider that is a purpose or my purpose. No. Even though technically and factually, I think that's a very reductionist explanation of what we do and what we are. But I think that's in one sense very unsatisfying and doesn't actually speak to the reality of sort of day-to-day existence.
And Peter Slezak, does that satisfy you, the idea that can you assign a purpose in that sense?
No, from what I was saying about the big P question, I don't need the big P question, but maybe you have to be cured of that. It's one of the things that you learn when you study philosophy and science. I mean, look, it's not new. Lucretius, in ancient times said there's just atoms in the void. That's the same point and that's what science tells you. So anything else you say after that, you're just making it up. It's just like, you're finding maybe aesthetic or religious reasons, but science doesn't warrant any of that. And maybe you stop needing it. I mean, I've got to the point where I don't need to, I'm quite satisfied. I read Bertrand Russell when I was 16, and he gave this sort of bleak picture that, it doesn't make any sense, but then he said it makes sense. He's got a lovely phrase that the purpose of life is something like, it's guided by knowledge and inspired by love, or something like that. It's rather eloquent. That's fine. That fits with the Lucretian view. You don't need more. Why do you need more? He says something like, happiness is no less happiness, or purpose is no less happiness because it comes to an end, because the universe is big, or, that's the only, and I think that's the scientific picture of the world. So it's odd that I'm, spouting the scientific view to two scientists, but you can be satisfied with that, and it's inspiring. And people like Bertrand Russell found a kind of an aesthetic and deeply emotional satisfaction from that. Einstein spoke that way. So it's not like you can't find those meanings consistent with this bleak picture.
Thanks. Now, over to the scientists then. Do you find science to be an exhaustive explanation of your experience of the world, like in that sense?
My purpose or my experience of the world?
An exhaustive explanation, that is an explanation that
covers everything.
rules out the idea of purpose, as Peter Slezak's been suggesting.
I guess that goes back to, can you actually explain everything? Can actually science, or is science the only pursuit that will bring you to truth? I think I've answered that for myself, but it's everyone to their own, I guess. For me, I think there are other ways to have truth. But definitely...
It's only on Sunday, though.
For some, perhaps.
And then to respond to that, I think I would say, philosophy is not science, but it is a way of attempting to understand and integrate the various pieces of information. So philosophy is one way of grappling with those non-scientific questions. And I don't think any of us are arguing about the ability of science to describe, define, predict what's going on in our world. Yep. The question that I think you framed to all of us in inviting us was, and where does this sit with that larger sense of purpose? And it could be a philosophic understanding, it could be a religious or a Christian understanding, or for many, it could be something I just didn't think about because they hadn't quite got to those deeper questions at this point.
Now, this will be our last question. We'll let it do the rounds here, and it's a question from the audience. That is, why do we do science? And does the enterprise of science actually teach us something about why we're here on this planet? If we're that curious, does that tell us something about what we're doing here? Anybody?
The scientists better answer that first.
Oh, I'll start. Look, I think it's intrinsically human, whatever that is, to want to know, define, and understand. And so, for that reason, that's why I think the enterprise called science has developed. It is a rigorous way of trying to know and identify and understand. Individually, as a geneticist, neuroscientist, the community is interested in how our genes work, how our brains work, because they've all got genes, they've all got brains, and they may not be scientists, but they're actually interested in the thing. Equally, I'm not a cosmologist, but there's, and I think you'd probably share this comment, that how many people are so interested in things astronomical and cosmological, even though at one level it really doesn't matter one iota. So I think that is something, to my mind, that is part of being human, of wanting to delve, to know, to understand.
Caroline?
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. I don't know what more to add. But I guess I will add something, I guess, with my field from astronomy and just what from my experience as well, with events similar to this, or also just public talks and so forth, just the sheer interest in the public, but everywhere. I'm not sure, I'm not an anthropologist, so I cannot say if this is everywhere of all humanity, but I have a suspicion it might have been that people always looked up and, what is this? Like, I wonder what this bright dot thing is, and we've worked out, it's a ball of gas burning, and I don't know, there's this thing, we all live under the same sky, we've all looked up at the sky and wonder where it comes from. And so I think, yeah, in a way, it's almost like our brains were, or we were given this sort of ability, if you want, either by nature or via evolution, or whether they're guided or not, whatever it is, I've got no idea, but, this ability to wonder and understand and grasp these concepts that in the end, like you said, probably don't matter.
Thanks. Peter?
Could I add a quick word? I agree with what you both said. I think it's deeply innate in us to seek the truth, to be curious. That's just built in. And science is the highest achievement, the highest realization of that attempt to understand the truth. But if I could add one other thing, the value of science is, as I was saying, I think earlier, it also gives you a method for seeking the truth and for avoiding the biases that prevent us from seeing the truth. That goes well beyond science into life and into politics, where it's very hard. People find it very hard to pursue the truth consistently. There's a lot of things that get in the way. Passions, politics, allegiances, tribal loyalties. And so science is the best model, and some of the leading philosophers have held up science as the model for life generally. And I think that's an inspiring and important value, which takes science seriously, as you said, the curiosity to follow the truth rigorously wherever it leads. So that's not just a scientific motivation, that's a kind of a moral one.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let's thank the panelists, and thank you very much, guys.